Another 100 paces, and he met the stream, clear and bubbling, running eastward toward the Chariton. He turned deeper into the woods, slowing, drawing long breaths to calm his pounding chest. Ahead, light streamed into a break in the forest, and he glimpsed the powder blue of her dress through the trees. She was standing with her back to him, arms raised as she twisted a delicate white flower into her hair. She seemed for a moment a part of the clearing, the flower springing naturally from her brown tresses, and the gathered skirt flowing as softly over her hips as the water of the spring, mingling at her feet with the flowered carpet of the island. "Suzanna," he said, surprised at the reverence in his voice. She turned, and with a graceful sweep of her hand, showed him her woodland retreat. "Isn't it beautiful?" He nodded absently, his eyes fixed on her face, and stepped across the brook to join her. She flushed lightly and reached to touch his face with tender fingers. "You're still swollen a bit. Does it hurt?" "Not that I notice." "I'm glad you came. I've been thinking about you." He laughed nervously. "You knew I would." She nodded, folded her skirts beneath her, and sat down amid the bright bouquet, extending a hand to draw him down beside her. "I want to know about you," she said, tucking her feet back under one hip and leaning on her hand. He sat cross-legged before her, nibbling on a long shoot of grass. "Not much to tell. We moved up here last November from Caldwell County. I'm working as an apprentice cooper with my father." "Are you a good cooper?" she asked, tilting her head to one side. "I'm getting better. My father doesn't think my work is as tight as it ought to be. I think it's as good as his, and he just doesn't want to admit it. But he doesn't like much that I do." He frowned and looked past her at the cascading stream. "This is a strange place to be a cooper, up here in the woods." David looked back at her, studying her eyes. They were deep and golden brown and shined innocently. "Not really. You can either live in town and have the wood brought to you, or live where the trees are and take the barrels to town. The barrels are easier to move." She laughed and seemed momentarily satisfied, then twisted around suddenly to face him, also sitting cross-legged with straight back and hands folded in her lap. "Are you a Mormon?" David felt the blood rush from his face and knew that she was watching him carefully. He smiled faintly and plucked another grass stem. "That's a strange thing to ask." "You are, aren't you?" He leaned backward onto both hands. "Why is that important to you?" "Because if you aren't, things will be simpler." David arched an inquiring brow. "Simpler?" "My family isn't too fond of Mormons, especially my brothers, and I want to be able to see you." David tossed the first grass stem aside and put the new one between his lips. "And if I am?" he asked. She looked at him intently. "If you are, things will certainly be more interesting." She was, he thought, an exceptionally lovely woman, and there was an honest curiosity in her frankness that disarmed him. "It appears things will be interesting, then," he said. Suzanna smiled a satisfied smile and also leaned back onto her hands, again tilting her head slightly as she studied him. "You must be terrible people to have everyone so worried about you." Her eyes laughed as she spoke. "Are you like Mohammedans or something?" David leaned forward again, picked a yellow flower from beside his knee, and began to pull the petals from it, one at a time. "I don't know much about Mohammedans, but we used to be Methodists. My father still is. We're pretty much like Methodists in most ways, and like you. At least, if you are like I think you are. We believe in God and all that." "And in the Holy Bible?" He nodded. "And in the saving grace of our Lord?" "Just the same." Suzanna let her arms collapse and stretched out on her back, hands behind her head, and gazed upward into the cloudless sky. "If we're alike, what makes you different?"